now that I made you stand up for the gospel reading, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the first reading from the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah's vision. On this first Sunday of Advent, we enter the season of waiting for something new, of looking inward to ready ourselves for the inbreaking of God into the world through the birth of baby Jesus. During these next 4 weeks, we'll travel from darkness toward light, from our old ways of being to something new. We light one more candle each Sunday, beginning with the hope candle today. But what does hope look like during Advent? What are we hoping for? Is it material things? Many of us have a place to call home and more than enough to eat. Warm clothing, access to doctors and medicine. And those who don't, who live without knowing where their next meal may come from, certainly hope for enough, and it's material things usually. Enough food, enough rent money, enough to buy medicine. Some of you know that I grew up in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, Big Stone Gap, Virginia, in a coal town. And even for there, we were a poor family. So when I was a little girl, I hoped for things. You can bet I hoped for things. I hoped for good food. I loved when they had Christmas things at the church where ladies would bring all kinds of good stuff, and I would eat a lot. I hoped for somebody else to carry in the coal and feed it into the stove because I hated carrying in the coal. As I got older, I hoped for toys. I wanted a spirograph so much, and I never got a new one, but I did get a used one. And a few years ago, still Sheehan, who goes to church here, bought me a spirograph because she knew the story, and I played with it. And as I got older, I thought about clothes, and I wanted clothes so I could fit in at school. And I needed the perfect jeans, the right jeans, and they may have come back around again, but it was Calvin Klein jeans is what I needed. And of course, they were terribly expensive. So I don't think I got them. But I didn't have big dreams. I didn't hope for justice or peace. I didn't think too much about the people around me and what they needed, except probably my sisters. And I think this is understandable. It helps to have the necessities of life to free your heart and mind to be able to think about others. There are people, though, who are really good at this, who can see beyond their own needs, even in desperate situations, and find ways to hope for a better world, to dream big, to try to bring God's vision for the world into being. And it's even us some of the times. We may have the moments where we don't do that, but there are lots of moments where we do, so we know we're capable of it. I see people who do this. You probably see them. Lately, I've noticed an undocumented Honduran father caring for his own family of 5. One child has special needs, and took in 3 more without knowing how he was going to feed any of them. And I went to visit Dale Lyles at Shannondale, and she's 89. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that. She's 89 years old, and she is at Shannondale recovering from a fall and trying to build her strength back up. And she didn't think she needed me there. There were more people who needed me more. She mentioned people who were sick or had surgery, and she didn't want me to spend too much time there with her. And all she wanted to do was get her strength back so she could get back here and help with the Christmas stuff. There's a young woman who was raised in this church who doesn't really attend the services much anymore. Her name is Sarah Margaret. And she is kind of not starting out in life. She seems really young to me. She's 20s. But she has a new old house, and she's in a relationship, and that house is old and needs lots of work on it. Yet, for the last several months, she has taken over the accompanying of Fabiana and her family, which entails all sorts of things. Moving them, taking them to appointments, making sure they have food, just being there for the 2 little girls. So that's somebody I think of when I think of somebody who can see beyond their own needs. And even some of our politicians, like council members that were running on the platform to, let's see, it was all the people for all people. and some of the presidential candidates who are daring to hope for something like universal health care, or, I mean, it's stuff that people say that can't happen, but they still dare to see that it can happen and that they're going to work on having it happen. They want to base our policies on how they will affect the least of us. And in the Hebrew text we heard this morning, Isaiah encourages us to dream big, to imagine what God's world could look like. If we look at the world around us right now or watch the news, thinking of conflicts and wars, divides within our family and the nation, and even in our friend group sometimes, damage to the earth that our way of life has caused, we should be able to relate to the Israelites. They had been 500 years either in exile or back, under the threat of destruction, under the threat of exile again. Yet Isaiah spoke to them of a world that was so different from what they saw around them, much like what we see around us, that it was nearly impossible to imagine. The prophet imagined for them, though, and for us, a world rich with possibility and promise. A vision of a mountain where all the peoples of the world can learn God's way, the way of peace. It's clear in this passage that God's going to do something new. Besides, we celebrate the baby Jesus coming every year. God is going to do something new again, and that's what we hope for. But there's work for us to do as well. In that passage, there's a lot of movement. Are we willing to move, to go up and forth, to climb the mountain, to beat our weapons of destruction into food-producing tools? You see, the season of Advent is a season of waiting. Waiting for the light to come out of the darkness, waiting for the birth of Jesus. But it's not only about waiting, it's about waiting with hope that our deepest yearnings for a new way of life can be fulfilled. I think that our holiday busyness, our rushing about to buy gifts, decorate our homes, attend celebrations, may be overlying something deeper. Some yearnings that we're afraid to hope for. Maybe a yearning for something big, something entirely new, like this vision that Isaiah sets out for us. So instead, we focus on the part that we can achieve. One scholar, Stacy Simpson Duke, writes that in this passage, Isaiah holds up a vision of the true, and that's capitalized. He takes us to a mountain and shows us what our hearts are actually tuned for. I love that vision of our hearts are tuned for something. And what Isaiah is telling us is that they're tuned for community and peace and learning God's way, not for greed or war. But something about us humans causes us to dream very small, to hope and wait for material things, to settle for family gatherings where nothing important is discussed so nobody gets in an argument, to immerse ourselves in the search for perfect gifts. And we are part of a culture that favors consumption and acquisition, even greed. But we as in humankind, have created that culture. And then we live in that world with what Walter Brueggemann calls numbed endurance and domesticated expectations. I think that is a very good description of what I feel a lot of the times at this time of the year. Numbed endurance and domesticated expectations. Every year at Christmas, I live out this lack of imaginative hope in my own life. I start out with the intention, the true intention of focusing on what is true, what my heart is tuned for. I promise myself that I will wait with hope for the light to come out of the darkness. I will believe in Isaiah's vision that it can actually happen. Then I catch myself. I start focusing on all those things that I kind of can make happen. And I think I've got to buy a gift for this certain person. Not necessarily a gift from the heart, but because I feel like I have to. Then I start stressing about Santa's workshop this past week. And I'll give you kind of an example of what I did with Santa's workshop. I think about what can we make that the parents will actually like, that uses recycled or natural materials, and glitters out, by the way. And the kids love glitter, so there's that. that will teach the kids about giving from the heart, not encourage overconsumption. And then I start looking for, where's the glue? Where's the Christmas fabric from last year? And I just start spinning out into that. Or the Advent liturgical vestments. Since John's gone this week, I'm the first week of Advent, and I have this idea that I wanted to do from darkness to light in fabric. And I'm telling you guys this because you would never probably get it, but I thought it was going to symbolize dark to light. So this week starts with navy, and then it'll get lighter blue as the weeks go by. So now you'll know what it's doing. However, it sent me everywhere looking for, I had to go out in the terrible mess to look for navy fabric because we didn't have any here. So I was like running around, I've got to make it perfect, I've got to get everything right, John's not going to be there, everybody's going to be looking. So then I get all kind of in that busyness and forget about what my intention was and what my focus was going to be. I get up and watch the news and catch myself feeling hopeless. I talk to my sister and worry about the divisions in my family, our community, our nation. I fall into that numbed endurance and allow my expectation of wonders to become domesticated. Shrunk down to almost nothing, to something I can run around and find and buy. So while justice and peace and God's vision for the world is what I want to focus on, I end up getting discouraged by the oppression and injustice that I see around me. I end up hating what I see going on around me, but feeling incapable of doing anything about it that will matter. I see a world overflowing with God's abundance, yet people are hungry and don't have homes. Can I bear to experience real hope in the face of this reality? Can you? Can we all? I think we can. I believe we can. And I know we can because we do it in flashes. We have to start within ourselves, our own hearts and minds, to seek out what Thomas Merton called the appetites and disorder in our own souls. And that busyness is a disorder, I think, in my soul. So in the progressive church, we often talk about societal sin or living in a culture of greed, and that's true, and that's somewhere we need to focus. But we also need to realize that we humankind created that culture of greed and acquisition. So what we have to do is stop wondering what we as individuals or a small church could possibly do that would change anything, and stop letting the sheer magnitude of the world's problems paralyze us. We can hope for a world where God's dream for us comes true. We must trust that it will and live into it. And while most of us exhibit that very human tendency toward lack of imaginative hope, toward smallness and selfishness, we are also capable of more. When we're feeling hopeless and helpless, when we can't envision a world of peace on our own, we can look to Isaiah's description of God's vision for us. Just when we can't see our way out of the darkness toward light, along comes Advent with God's promise that something new is about to happen. Because I was thinking a lot about buying things, about myself, not necessarily you guys, but I was thinking a lot about how much buying things falls into this for me. I looked at a book called The Christian Consumer, Living Faithfully in a Fragile World. And author Laura Hartman in that book outlines a lot of things that we can do that start in the home, then the church, community groups, out to the world. I'm not going to tell you about those, but it's a pretty good book. One thing she writes in that book is, we are prone to sin, but called to renounce it. We are creatures who can and should delight in creation. We are neighbors who can love ourselves and one another. And we are denizens of the new creation who can and should align our actions with those of a fulfilled world. We are not, or need not be, greedy, lacking, and shallow. So with that in mind, I want to give us a challenge for this first week of Advent. When we feel pulled toward busyness, let's recognize that it